This MSI MEG Z690 Godlike costs £1,850 here in the UK. A huge amount of money for a motherboard. It comes with a liquid cooler and some DDR5 memory, so the board itself £1,350 approximately. By contrast, this MEG Z690 Unify is about £500, £520. It's a huge difference. Is there anything that can possibly justify the extra cost of the Godlike? Have you ever seen a motherboard package as large as this? Because I certainly have not. Clearly, it contains lots of stuff. Let us investigate. Also, there's one press sample doing the rounds in the UK. This one has been around the houses a bit, so the fact that the box is damaged is not indicative of how it comes when it's new. We have Kingston Fury Beast X DDR5 memory. Motherboard, box tears a bit more, and here we have some stuff you will not have seen before. You get a motherboard stand, DIY job, manuals and such like, accessories, and here we have a 360mm all-in-one liquid cooler. Plus a couple more boxes of bits and pieces. The MSI MEG CoreLiquid S360 costs £250. 32GB of Kingston Fury Beast DDR5 5200. So between the two of them, this is £500 of hardware. If you're intending to buy that precise memory and you want to use this precise cooler on this motherboard, then clearly that's a legitimate consideration. If on the other hand you'll want to do custom loop cooling, or you want to use Corsair or G-Skill RAM, or perhaps RGB RAM even, then is this money down the drain? Anywho, we have this hardware as part of the package along with all this other good stuff. So this is a motherboard stand in many parts, and in essence you assemble 6 of those, and once the motherboard's propped up on those stands, you can mount a fan underneath to do some bench testing. Cables galore to go with the motherboard. SATA cables. I'm sure some people will use SATA drives with this. However, this is of more interest. DisplayPort pass-through, mini DisplayPort one end, regular DisplayPort t'other, because on the humongous I/O panel we have 2 mini DisplayPorts all ready for DisplayPort pass-through. There's no doubt in my mind that the hardware in this motherboard is going to be top notch, but how does this ultra mega high-end Godlike compare to the Z690 Ace, which is the next one down the product stack, or the Z690 Unify that I showed you a few seconds ago? When Intel launched their 12th gen platform with the Z690 chipset, MSI and the other motherboard manufacturers stepped up their game. We've got support for PCI Express Gen 5 graphics, Gen 4 storage, DDR5 memory, and really good support for power delivery. So when you look at the MEG Z690 Unify costing £520, you see many good features. However, nothing is particularly surprising. Stepping up to the £620 MEG Z690 Ace, we've got a very similar motherboard, except it has more bling. There's gold touches, and also we have RGB. Stepping up to the Godlike, MSI has clearly started with the Ace and Unify and then added lots of everything. The power delivery, 20 plus 2 phases of 105 amp power stages. The 8-layer PCB is something we're already familiar with. As you can see, the Godlike is covered with armour across the entire board. This is clearly intended to help cooling as well as the styling. And then MSI has pushed the boundaries, so we have 6 M.2 connectors, and these have magnetic covers to make life easy when you're installing your hardware. Running down the headline features, we have dual PCI Express Gen 5 graphics support, DDR5 memory support naturally. You have dual front USB 3.2 Gen 2x2 20GB, where many boards only have one connector, and naturally you have HD audio. On the rear I/O we have 10GB Ethernet and 2.5GB Ethernet, where the lesser boards have dual 2.5GB. We have Wi-Fi 6E and dual Thunderbolt 4. Next to the Thunderbolts, we have the mini display ports to give us pass-through from our graphics card directly to the I/O and out to those Thunderbolt products. It is clear that MSI has packed a good amount of hardware into the Godlike, although at this price we'd expect nothing less. And then they've added something extra. The M-Vision dashboard, which is a touchscreen display on the motherboard that can be used to display lighting and data, and can also be used to control functions of the motherboard. The M-Vision dashboard? What's that? We're used to the idea of armour on motherboards that includes the display that reports, for example, the CPU temperature or the clock speed. That's not unusual. In this instance, we have a module which is both a display and a control unit. So when it's on the board and held in place with magnets, it will light up and tell you stuff, as we'll see in a little while. But if you choose, you can remove it. Take this accessory cable, connect it. MagSafe, that's an idea. Why don't we see that in other devices? If only somebody would use MagSafe on something else. And then we can plug into a USB port. And now we have a display that is also a touchscreen control device, and it has a little speaker in there so it can make noises, so that'll be interesting. So we can stand at a distance controlling our motherboard rather than just using control software or the BIOS in the usual style. I mean, it's certainly novel. As to whether it's worth many hundreds of pounds, that's a question we'll have to address shortly. And you may have noticed the motherboard is standing on these plastic feet. Let's just take that off. This is fiddly. Aligning the motherboard is awkward. You have to do it by touch. Some sort of framework that would help. But this strikes me as being a bit of a gimmick. Let's pull off some of these covers and see what those 6M.2s look like. And what's involved in getting under this to get to the VRM heatsinks. The topmost M.2 cover, held in place with 2 conventional screws, has a little connector for RGB, presumably in this little panel. So not magnetic, but something technical going on. Off with this cover, I think. Next. Normally that would be the chipset cover, but there's a huge amount of other stuff going on in this part of the board. And that reveals the second screw for this cover, which again has a connector, so 2 M.2s there. Where are we up to? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 under here. There we have it, support for 6 M.2s plus the 6 laid down SATA, a full dozen drives. How do we get under here? Off, I think, with the back plate, and then we'll see what lies beneath. 8 screws, and away with the back plate, which, that's steel. Got some thermal pads for the backs of the VRMs, and away with the VRM heatsinks. And disconnect that little cable there. And now we can see the main features of the motherboard. So we have the 20+2 power stages, 20 for the CPU, 2 for the SoC, 105 amps per stage, and the main VRM controller can handle 20 phases, so no doublers required. We don't have any graphics outputs on the rear I/O, as you'd expect from such a high-end motherboard, therefore No need for the 20 plus 1 plus 1, 20 plus 2 plus 1 configuration, just 20 plus 2. Having said that, it is slightly amusing to me that the spec of this motherboard suggests, in addition to the obvious K-SKU processors supported by this board, in addition you can have a non-K processor, you can even go down to a Pentium. Why you do that makes no sense to me. You might just as well limit this board to only supporting the mega high-end overclocking processors. In fact, you might as well ditch Core i5 while you're at it. Can you imagine putting a Core i5 in a £1,800 motherboard? The rear I/O, we can see that the DisplayPort in Thunderbolt out is a separate little PCB all on its own. There's plenty to discuss in the layout of the motherboard, but buttons on the rear I/O are always a curious one to me. So we have clear CMOS and BIOS flashback. When the motherboard is mounted on a test bench like so, those are great. When it's in a case and that's around the back, not so great. And the idea of reaching around the back blindly in your PC and accidentally hitting one of those buttons is terrifying. We have the main power and reset buttons on the foot of the motherboard. Let us run down the main features of the board. So we've got the 6 M.2s. The top M.2 is powered by the CPU, is Gen 4 x 4. The second M.2 comes off the chipset, also Gen 4x4. This, with the slightly different coloured tape, is the main SSD that runs off the CPU and is Gen 5x4. This is Gen 4x4 from the chipset, as is this. And this final M.2 running off the chipset is Gen 3x4. So against all expectations, that is the SSD you start with and then you populate away from there. We have 3 PCI Express expansion slots, Gen 5x16, Gen 5x8. So in the event you're installing 2 graphics cards, Crossfire and SLI are both supported on this board. Gen 5x8, 2 of. SLI and Crossfire, they just aren't a thing at present, and I struggle to believe they're going to be a thing in the future. So that strikes me as slightly peculiar. And then the bottom slot is Gen 4x4. And then we have 6 SATA ports laid down on the side next to the USB and the power. So in terms of expansion and storage options, this board's got absolutely everything you could possibly want, and it's very easy to make the case that actually it's overly complicated. After removing 3 more screws, we can lift up the, what would it be, dock, I suppose, for the M-Vision panel. And you can see there's a handful of little cables in there, and it's simply occupying some space directly above the 24-pin power connector. Let's put that back. And we're all set to take a quick tour of the board. You can see what's going on more easily with the VRM heatsink removed and all the shields from both the front and the back. At the top of the board we have a pair of fan headers and a pair of EPS connectors. They're reversed from the usual positions. Generally the CPU headers would be above the memory slots and the EPS connectors would be over by the I/O panel. Here we have a Corsair RGB connector, another fan header and a postcode debug display. Around the side of the board we have a number of laid down headers and connectors. So we start with ARGB, then we have 3 fan headers, the 24-pin power connector, Type C's for the front panel USB, Type A's for front panel USB, the 6 SATA connectors, 2 more fan headers, and then working across the bottom of the board in the corner we have a flick switch which allows us to use the M-Vision panel with that extension cable, front panel headers, another ARGB header, a specialist connector for monitoring water flow if you're using custom loop, power and reset buttons, USB 2.0, 2 more fan headers, and the audio. On the rear I/O panel we have the HD audio, antenna points for the Wi-Fi 6E, the 2 mini display ports already mentioned, the pair of Thunderbolt 4 connectors which are Type C's. If you're using Thunderbolt 4, those are 40 gigabits per second. If you're connecting to USB 4, 20 gigabits per second, and USB 3.2, 10 gigabits per second. Each port can daisy chain up to 3 Thunderbolt 4 devices or 5 Thunderbolt 3 devices. Then we have 8 USB 3.2 Gen 2 10 gigabit connectors, 4 powered by the chipset and 4 by a separate controller. The Ethernet, we have a Quantia 10 gigabit and Intel 2.5 gigabit. We're going to take a look in the BIOS of the Z690 Godlike. As I turn it on, listen carefully. That noise is not, as I first thought during my testing, a failing pump on the AIO liquid cooler. That would be embarrassing for MSI. No, it's Lucky the Dragon roaring away from the M-Vision display unit. I don't like that one little bit. The BIOS will be familiar to anyone who's looked at an MSI motherboard in recent times. So here we are in easy mode, and if we click, let's have a quick look at some of the bits and pieces. I mean, look at storage. I've got a single M.2 installed, and yes, not much more to say than that really. We've got 2 XMP profiles built in, even though XMP3 supports 3 profiles plus a couple of user profiles. Let's go into advanced mode. Overclocking. So at the moment everything is on auto. Overclocking this has been quite straightforward. If we just go to a multiplier of 50 times, and now we're at 5.0 gigahertz for the P cores and E cores 4.0. This processor, this Core i9 1200K, will happily go to 5.1 gigahertz. In this motherboard, actually, I feel like it might have gone slightly further, but there is very little benefit to overclocking Alder Lake because they quite clearly are delivered pretty much running at their limits. I personally think MSI has missed a trick here. This motherboard makes no sense unless you're using a top-notch processor, realistically a Core i9 12900K, conceivably a Core i7 12700K. Anything else, I just don't begin to understand it. So they could have really stripped the BIOS down to support very specific high-end SKUs of processor. And they haven't done that. It supports the entire family, including Celerons, Pentium Golds and all sorts, and that just strikes me as slightly nuts. Anyway, onward with our testing. The test setup I'm using is fairly familiar. We have the Core i9 1200K processor, a Sabrent Rocket 4.0 SSD, Palit RTX 3080 graphics card, Seasonic Prime 1300 watt power supply. The changes we originally used in testing a Corsair 360mm AIO cooler. I've switched to the MSI it's included in the bundle, and previously I used Corsair DDR5 memory, and I switched to the Kingston memory included in the MSI bundle. Having said that, the speeds of the memories very similar, and both the previous and the current coolers are 360mm AIOs. In our testing, Bapco Crossmark favours Intel's new 12th gen architecture, and Core i9 soars to the top of the charts exactly as we'd expect, the Godlike topping the charts by a small margin. In Blender 3, the Godlike performs well, however it is beaten soundly by the Gigabyte Aorus Master. It's a similar story in 3D Mark TimeSpy, just the CPU test. The Godlike does well, the Master does better. In Far Cry 6 at 1080, the Godlike beat the Master by the tiniest of margins. It's a similar story in Far Cry 6 at 1440. The Master wins, but by 1 or 2 frames per second. In the great scheme of things, it's a dead heat. In Watch Dogs Legion at 1080, you can barely tell the difference between the Gigabyte Aorus Master and the Godlike, and at 1440p, the spread in frame rates is utterly trivial. Ada 64 memory bandwidth. This is one of the tests where the subtle differences in the specs of the memory used in the different benchmarks does tell. So the Godlike with the Kingston beats out the other motherboards that used the Corsair DDR5, but it's a small difference. CPU temperature. This is interesting. It's crystal clear that the combination of the Godlike and the MSI liquid cooler are doing stellar work. Very impressive temperatures. And those temperatures are despite power consumption, which is absolutely in line with the other motherboards. You can see that at 5.1 gigahertz, the Godlike is drawing the same system power almost exactly as the Aorus Master of 5.0 gigahertz. Very little to choose between these systems in terms of power consumption, and yet the MSI is running a lot cooler. The VRM temperature chart shows that both the Godlike and the Aorus Master are performing brilliantly well. These temperatures are so close to each other that it's impossible to separate them. RGB. There's a lot of RGB going on here. We've got RGB on the motherboard in a relatively conventional way, plus we've got the M.2 heat shields, those frozers, which include some RGB lighting. We have RGB over the I/O panel. We've got the M-Vision panel. The graphics card has RGB. The pump cover over the liquid cooler, that also has RGB. There's RGB, and the monitor has RGB. The mouse keyboard has RGB. So in terms of the MSI stuff, if you take the cover on the pump body out of the equation and try and ignore the graphics card and focus on the motherboard itself, you've got a big block of RGB here, some little bits and pieces there, and a big block here, controlled by the MSI Center software and Mystic Light. Let's have a quick dig around in the software and then we'll get into the M-Vision dashboard. MSI Center. Hardware monitoring tells us all the stuff we expect to see about clock speeds and CPU load and stuff like that. Go to Features, CoreLiquid. This is the 360mm AIO cooler. Again, we've got settings for the display. We can change an image. We can, if we choose, somewhat bizarrely show live weather on the display. We can also go into fan setting and pick a fan curve or set a custom fan curve for the various fans. And if we go back to Features, Mystic Light, we can see here the motherboard with all the different bits and pieces of RGB going on. Clearly at the minute they're all linked together and we're in Rainbow Marquee. Click on M-Vision Dashboard, little cog, and we can do something similar with the M-Vision display. So we can choose to have hardware monitor set, we can put an image on there of our choosing, we can show the clock, or once again, for some bizarre reason, live weather. What is it with weather? And that is the MSI Center. That's using the M-Vision display as a display rather than a control unit. With the M-Vision dashboard on its 1.2 meter cable, making silly noises, we can now use it as a control unit. So we can open a browser or a calculator. I mean, what? And the touchscreen itself is horribly unresponsive. I have mixed views about displays on products such as the liquid cooler, because after all, to read the temperature or the fan speed or whatever, you have to look at it, which means if the PC is under your desk, you've got to literally get on your hands and knees and look through the window. If it's on a desk, you've still got to take a proper look. So the idea of looking at a display that's going to tell you about overclocking that's on the motherboard itself, I'm not particularly interested in that. The idea that that display doubles up as a control unit, I've never in all my born days thought that's a feature I might want. And then the idea that control unit could be removed from the motherboard on a cable and used like you might control some industrial machinery. I don't begin to understand that. It's a tiny display, and when you're controlling your motherboard using the BIOS screen or the software in Windows, you're working on a big screen with a mouse and a keyboard. I don't see what the M-Vision dashboard brings to the party. But happily, MSI has given us a huge great presentation to tell us exactly that. So we learn the IPS screen is resistive touch, and that means it basically takes quite a thump to make it work. And then you go through the various features that you can control from the unit. For example, BIOS flashback. Provided the LEDs flashing on the I/O panel do their job correctly, who needs the display to tell you what's going on? Detect hardware status. Well, we have postcode debug. I'm sure that could be enhanced. This just seems like it's over the top. The idea of shutting down or restarting your PC from a tiddly little display, that's peculiar. Why does MSI think a countdown timer is a good idea for this control unit? Going into the advanced mode, look at the functions on offer. Tuning controller for overclocking your PC. Calculator, music player, browser. There are many slides detailing all sorts of functions and ending with live weather. And truth be told, none of it makes the first bit of sense to me. So no, the M-Vision dashboard really does not do a great deal for me. You'll understand a review leads towards a buying decision. Should you or should you not buy the MSI MEG Z690 Godlike? And the funny thing is, it almost doesn't matter what I say in this review because you probably cannot buy the Godlike. The reason is that MSI is intending to make and sell about 500 of these motherboards globally, something like 40 to the UK, presumably many hundreds to the USA, and the rest distributed mainly across Europe. And unless you have bought and registered a 3000 series graphics card, obviously MSI product, or a previous MSI Godlike motherboard, you're not on the list to be invited to buy the Z690 Godlike. So whether you have the money or not, whether you like it or do not, it almost doesn't matter. Which is a funny state of affairs. So let's go through Leo's pros and cons of this mighty motherboard. The pros, and I'm bigging these up to the nth degree. Glorious bling, RGB and LCD screens galore. They're not particularly my thing, but if that is your thing, this board does it, and big time. Colossal VRMs with mega cooler. No argument there. You don't need VRMs that are this epic. But if you want epic VRMs, these are the best in the business. 6 M.2 slots. 3 slots, 4 slots is plenty for most people, but if you think 5 or 6 is what you require, this is the motherboard for you. DisplayPort pass-through to Thunderbolt 4. Again, not a feature I'm going to use because I'm not in the Thunderbolt ecosystem, but for the niche customer that wants that function, this board supplies it. Cons, the negative points. The MVision dashboard feels like a gimmick. Just fundamentally, to my mind, it is flawed. In addition to the fundamental point, however, I don't think it's been done very well. The resistive touchscreen, it just doesn't work correctly in my opinion. So that's 2 separate strikes against the headline feature of this motherboard. Crazy high price. You might have thought that would be the number one negative point, but the thing is, you've already made your mind up about this board. If you think £1,800 and something for a motherboard bundle, admittedly, is too much, way too much, hugely too much, it doesn't really matter what I say. And if you think, wow, I love it, £1,850, including some extra bits and pieces, that's fine by me. Again, doesn't much matter what I say. Finally, the bundle includes the cooler and DDR5 memory. And the thing is, you might not want this cooler, which is a good cooler, or this memory, which is decent memory. You might want to use custom loop or a different brand of memory, in which case it's hundreds and hundreds of extra pounds down the Kazi. So, the bundle, I don't think is a particularly good idea, but I do think the quality of the hardware they've included is good. Overall, would I buy this motherboard? No, of course I wouldn't. No interest to me whatsoever. Are you interested? Genuinely, I'm interested to hear. Please hit those comments below. Let us know what you think about the MSI MEG Z690 Godlike.